Good morning and welcome to the Net.lol podcast. Our podcast, this is the week of February 22nd, 2022. Hope you're all doing well. We've got a fine guest on today, Peter Sprygada. He's at Itential and got some really interesting background in network automation, networking, and all that. We're going to have some fun today. I'm here with two of my co-hosts. Kyle couldn't make it today, but Mr. Tucker and Mr. Salisbury are here today. So, hi guys, good to see you again.
Hey.
So let's jump right into it. Peter, can you tell us about yourself? Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, what your interests are, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is interesting from the aspect. Well, I think it's interesting. Some people don't. My wife certainly doesn't. It's all good. So it really started, in the kind of the traditional networking ranks, and really followed service provider technology. I can trace my roots all the way back to my first job in networking was actually installing TDM switches. Yes, I am actually that old.
Oh, wow.
That's actually
nice.
What I did. And
Nice.
got into this whole networking business and followed that really kind of through the SP, technology trends. So we went, obviously TDM, and then I got into ATM frame relay and, core IP, and then IP MPLS, blah, blah, blah. And on we went. So a lot of networking startups, some good, some not. But eventually I kind of ran out of startups to go to. If y'all remember, there was a point in time there just wasn't a lot of innovation in networking. And so
They all just disappeared, right?
They did.
That was like
Absolutely.
when that period we were talking about, just before OpenFlow kind of started and that whole clean slatey thing.
That's right. So I ended up at Cisco. I ended up at Cisco. As it almost feels like, when you live that world, eventually you end up at either Cisco or Juniper at some point in your career.
Yep. At least once.
Whether it's at least once, exactly. So I ended up in Cisco, and then I had the extreme fortune to take a chance and jump over to Arista very, very early on.
Yep.
So I was with Arista early on and was with them through IPO, but that's when really kind of the real story starts. When I was actually at Arista, I spent a lot of time building what today is known as the EOS Plus group, and it was really a group that was designed not to follow traditional network engineering paradigms, but to figure out how to work with customers to operationalize EOS-based solutions using kind of DevOps-y style implementations. So in other words, I got really involved in, the puppets and chefs and CF engines of the world. And
that was all the rage at that time. Yep.
It absolutely was.
I remember talking to Fenner when that thing started, and it was really like what you described. I mean, his perspective was vendors aren't doing it right, and operators need it to work like this, and let's just do it. And
that's exactly it.
And a lot of it was really just automation and API interfaces, right? It was
that's right.
Today it sounds really simple, but then it was monumental,
it was,
right?
Yeah, I can remember
you don't need
having
CLI? Wait a minute.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I got involved in a little community project where we were actually building a network abstraction layer for Puppet. And I was doing that in concert with Jeremy Schulman. I'm sure you all know the name.
Yeah, we had Schulman on recently.
Oh, excellent. So anyway, him and I, he was still at Juniper at the time. I was at Arista, and we, really worked together on the net dev stuff that ultimately ended up turning over to Puppet. But kind of through all that, I got introduced to the good folks at Ansible, and they convinced me to come on board. And I was really skeptical at first. That was a big move, right? Here's my background. I'm talking, at this point, I'm still understanding, how to build, global scalable IP infrastructure and, how to build, leaf-spine infrastructure. And now all of a sudden I'm looking at taking this job at a software company. My God, a software company.
What are you doing, right?
Exactly. But, we went back and forth, and eventually I did agree to come on board, and I'm glad I did. It really it was a tremendous opportunity to really kind of start. I don't want to say start because that's not fair. I can't honestly take credit for, obviously what Ansible did. And I certainly can't take credit for what Ansible Networking did. That was, there was already a groundswell. All I did, I came on board and I really tried to help organize it and
Well, you sorted it out. I mean, that was the
exactly.
problem. At that point, when you got there, and that's maybe the dangerous part, like that you're referring to, right? That gave you pause was, wow, this is yet another one of these things, right? At that time, it wasn't
Exactly.
clear, right, that this was going to be the thing, right?
Exactly. And so it was nerve-wracking, but again, I'm glad I did it, and it turned out obviously very well. I think I'm really proud of what Ansible has become, and specifically what Ansible Networking had become.
Yeah.
And it's really, I think, whether or not you agree with, Ansible's approach or what Ansible does, or even if you know Ansible, I think one of the things that it did though is it really helped
Well, maybe,
drive
sorry,
this narrative.
for folks that might not understand, you want to give them the back of the napkin. What is Ansible? Like,
Sure, yeah. So
I'm assuming a lot of people understand what this thing is, but maybe they don't.
I mean, Ansible is, and continues to this day to be a automation framework for being able to declaratively describe infrastructure and then realizing it through a very simple implementation. It's not that the concept was new. The concept was not new. In fact, the concept had been around for a long time. Where Ansible really changed the game, though, is they simplified it. They removed agents. They tried to really reimagine what it took to automate infrastructure and build a framework that allowed you to automate infrastructure really through document creation. And in the Ansible world, we call that thing a playbook, right?
Yep.
And it was designed to look and feel and read more like a document than an actual, set of code. That was really kind of the original idea.
Because if you remember, like rewinding back to that time, I've experienced this challenge many times now, and until very recently, actually, where sales engineers, SEs, and sales solutions architects, and those types, if we rewind back, everybody now does automation, and they're into it, right? But there was a transition from NetOps to DevOps to the automation that we do today. And it's really important, actually. That's a really important thing that Ansible did that made it palatable for NetOps people to get into DevOps. It was not, I mean, the biggest challenge was that you had engineers that were not computer science type people, and they were not going to write a C program at the time or
Correct.
whatever, right?
Correct.
And I remember having like I literally had SEs like in tears. They were like, "Oh my God, my job's over. I can't do this. I can't learn."
We were writing Perl at the time, actually. Well, I think the really key to the super exciting part of I think the game changer was the agentless piece that you mentioned, Peter, because the boxes were all black boxes back then, right? We aren't talking about Linux switches. We're talking about proprietary operating systems. So that was pretty huge. And the simple layout, right? Like, okay, you understand what a configuration is, and each of these little slots you change, in each configuration, that now becomes a variable. So it's like, I don't know, super training wheels into.
And that's the transition of config to code. It's actually turned into code, but I don't think a lot of those DevOps people realize, or NetOps people realized what they were doing, but it was really clever.
Yeah,
and cleverly
the
disguised.
simplification was like the major piece for me, at least, because I spent time trying to make things installable with config management systems, and I remember very vividly trying to make a recipe or whatever it was called for Chef, and the level of like. You had all of these analogies. You needed this thing called knife, and then you needed something else, and then something else.
Yeah, it got out of control, right?
You go down this rabbit hole.
I need a spoon and a
yeah,
shovel.
I just wanted to make this thing installable, and yet, like, Ansible was very much like, it's stuff that I know about. It's freaking SSH. Like, I know how SSH works. I know that eventually it's just running freaking commands the other end. It's like way easier to picture just coming from a professional ops background. That was a massive thing for me.
Well, that was the beauty of it too, because you guys started with the fact that there were other devices that you had to be malleable to wrap them and talk to them. It wasn't just an SSH thing. Eventually, it was you speak all kinds of of things to the devices and so on. But it was easily packaged in there and simplified, kind of hidden. You know, you say, I want to talk to the switch. That's kind of what Jeremy was talking with us about.
Yeah,
That
and
was really powerful.
it's interesting. You kind of mentioned some of the the original config management style tools, and one of the things that used to frustrate me, y'all could probably remember this. You think about what those tools used to do, and you wanted to make a simple change on a device, didn't matter what it was. So you get your tool up and finally running, and you go to make that simple change. Maybe it's a description on the interface. Then you log back into the device, and all of a sudden you see all these new config commands that showed up in the config. It's like, where the hell did all this come from?
What happened?
I didn't ask for this. Right.
Right.
And so, I think that was, one of the things that we tried really hard with Ansible for is to make sure that we only did what we were asked to do and not try and take over the world. And that was a real big key, especially
and that
for
was a
network
mistake
engineers.
some of those other frameworks did. They were
Yep.
trying to effectively replace the CLI.
Correct.
And
Correct.
that's never going to happen with those devices.
That's right.
It's
Well, and it led to a lot of distrust, right? Network engineers fundamentally do not trust software to perform these activities, and that's the big reason why.
Yep.
Because they just do things without being told to do them.
Yep.
So it was important we didn't repeat that sin.
Yeah, that's really cool the way that progressed on, and even today. I mean, I talked to the kind of automation DevOps engineers today, and it's a kind of a typical story. Of these things we're talking about. Overcomplicated, I can't code, and I don't trust the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Other frameworks we've seen that, right? You go push a change, and, with Salt or Chef or Puppet, one of the, I've seen this happen in every one of these where you push it out, it's not clear that it took, kind of like your thing, and then you go log back into the box and you go, wait a minute. This didn't do everything.
Exactly. I'll never forget the first time it happened to me. I logged back in. It was an iOS device. I logged back in, and there's the command, no deck mop. What the hell is that?
Yeah,
I'm very early in my network career. I had no idea what that was. I'm like, where did that come from?
Yeah. So this is really cool how it's. Go ahead, Brent. Sorry.
I mean, if anything, at least Ansible eradicated Telnet, because if I remember you on
Here's a great little story though for you. Honestly, I mean, we used to, so for those of you who don't know, and just to share with the listeners, so Ansible predominantly got built through IRC. That's where all the conversation happened around Ansible. And if you wanted anything in Ansible, you had to go to, at the time it was Freenode. They've since moved on from that, but I think
that's where it all happened.
Now. But I mean, you could sure as hell bet once we got started with networking, it wasn't week, but a couple weeks into it, and sure enough, someone showed up. Can I get support for a Telnet connection plugin? No, absolutely not. Sadly, though, I have to admit there actually is a Telnet plugin in Ansible now at this point in time. But
oh man, nice. Yeah, I'd like Telnet, and I'd like some TDM, please.
Yeah, exactly. There was going to be a line I was going to draw somewhere, though. The first one who asked for TL1 or an Acorba interface. No, absolutely not. We got to draw a line somewhere.
No. TL1, I guess. Yeah. Cool.
Exactly.
So
what are some of like the newer tools? Like what else are you seeing? So I mean, you had an early vision on this. What else are you seeing in the community? NetOps actually adopting today. Like I love the practicality of talking with you is fun, right? Because a lot of times it's this might be interesting in 5 years, but this is something.
Yeah, exactly.
This is here now. Yeah.
This is the practical path of it. Some of us went down this like bizarre data path. We're going to change it.
Indeed. But there's so much going on. First and foremost, I think that in and of itself is exciting. If there's one thing that I think Ansible helped contribute to, and certainly wasn't alone in this, but one thing that really, is exciting in our industry is we're seeing just a lot of innovation across the board in around automation, network automation, and how to turn to software to solve some very complex problems. I think that there's some interesting work going on right now about, how do we adopt a lot of the pipeline concepts that have existed in software development world for a long time? How do we adopt some of those ideas to configuration management and to automation of network devices? I think there's some really exciting work going on in the world of how do we start to invert the whole idea. What I mean by that is, how do we how do we, today predominantly we start with a device config and we think about how do we get that config to where we want it. I think there's some really exciting work starting to happen around, let's change that philosophy. Let's start with what we want and then generate the config from that. And in a lot of respects, start to make the config irrelevant.
That's the
Right?
declarative part, right? Declare what you want, and
Exactly.
then we'll massage it into the code it needs to be to be realized, right?
Exactly. And then the last thing, well, not the last thing, but the other kind of area that is I'm watching really closely, I think is super exciting, is how do we turn to software to help us test infrastructure? I mean, we've all been there, right? I mean,
Yep.
testing infrastructure, production infrastructure is not easy. It is, when you deal with a big global infrastructure, it is really hard to understand if the change you just made has some adverse effect halfway around the world.
And that's the challenge too today, where
Mhm.
software is part of the infrastructure, right? You've got virtualized elements all over the place that are doing
Yep.
things. You push a change to that software element, it's as impactful either way
Absolutely.
as the real thing,
Without
right?
question.
But it's
Without
definitely
question.
it's still kind of a missing link though, right? There's still not a clear here's how you emulate networks before you hit the
Oh, no doubt.
before the batch runs. Like here's what without setting up separate networks basically, or like a really scaled down tiny deployment of what you're trying to test.
Right. It's
Uh,
always a simulated approximation
right.
of the real thing, and that's kind of the challenge. Part of it is, and that's the testing part. Peter's talking about
Hmm.
when that's the element that's kind of was missing from the Ansible story. It's okay, we're going to push it out, and if the box tells me it's done, it's okay. Well, maybe not. That's just a
Exactly.
config thing. Like, is it really doing what I told it to do? And that's the testing element that comes on after the fact. I'll push the thing, I'll check it all out, and that's the trick though, is to check it all out. Like you can test, like Brent, what you're talking about. Like the testing thing, is it kind of almost a static analysis of a single node or a couple of simulated nodes, or is it a 5,000 node simulation, which is a pretty complicated thing to get running.
Hmm.
But
Absolutely.
and that's maybe a good segue into like the iTential stuff you're doing today,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
kind of
And
tackling that, right?
it is, so obviously I made the decision to leave Ansible, and that was a tough decision. I'll admit that was a really hard decision to make. And it was kind of, we were kind of laughing a little bit before we actually started the podcast about sometimes you kind of make that trip to the dark, you kind of make that weird path choice. Well, I
Yep.
made one of those, and I spent a year kind of out of the industry, doing some multi-cloud networking as a service kind of concept stuff, and have since come back now to network automation and whatnot. But that was my one kind of interesting. Yeah. But anyway, going to iTential though, it's I think that while Ansible continues to evolve and continues to do everything it does, and it's very exciting to see what they do and how they're going about doing it. I think that there's a bigger picture, and you're touching on it here around testing. There's a bigger picture about how do you automate the overall change process. We spent a lot of time focusing on the action of automation, right? The action of executing the automation. That's what Ansible does, and it does it very, very well.
Yep.
What Ansible doesn't do well, and that's by design, is that it doesn't really orchestrate an end-to-end change that has the requirement to tie to multiple separate systems, that has the requirement to change and transform data from one format to another, to incorporate testing, to incorporate ticketing systems. Could you do all that with Ansible? Absolutely, you could.
Yeah.
But it's a heavy lift, and you start to take Ansible to unnatural places. And this is where I
Yep.
was really excited to join the folks at iTential,
Cool.
because that's really what they're focusing on.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction between Ansible and what's going on today. Actually, is that as I was saying earlier, Ansible is kind of focused on one target, right? It's
Yep.
configuring a target or loading an image on a target or whatever. But when it's done, it's done. And
That's
it's that global picture that's important. That we've back to the whole networking thing. I mean, how many times is having a global view of the universe critical, right? We first did this with traffic engineering. We realized you can't do these localized changes because they might impact somebody 3 hops away. And then
Yep.
we did this with SDN, where we realized the whole open flow thing with a single centralized controller was cute accept in a real network, and because there were other
Indeed.
things around, and
Indeed.
and it's that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And then the other aspect of it, and this is something, I mean, I believed in my days at Ansible. I even believed in my days before Ansible, and that is, for these types of tools and paradigm shifts and whatnot to really take hold and change the industry, they have to be more accessible to everybody. It can't just simply be the uber smart guy in the group that does all of the work, right? It's got
Yeah.
to be everybody. And so I think, one of the things that Itential is doing, and this isn't unique to Itential, but I do think it's one of our strengths, is starting to introduce some of the low code, no code technology. And
Yep.
how do you start to make some of this concept, how do you make this accessible to engineers? From the aspect that, and I always love to tell the story, and I think we can all, appreciate this, is that, you can't get very far in any meeting with networking people before, easily within the first 5 to 7
Or
minutes,
it
someone's going to be at the
devolves.
whiteboard drawing, right? That's just
Yes.
what we do. We are visual thinkers by nature. And so I think that being able to adopt that same paradigm to how you actually build workflows is going to be a real key to how companies continue to scale automation. And
Well, it's
that's
interesting. Are you
that's what we're
talking
doing.
about like a no code future for this stuff? I mean, if you notice, or a
Hmm.
light code future, I guess. But
Yep.
interesting thing is if you think about like the success in other spaces with, it's obviously not no code, but it's lighter code,
Hmm.
traditional lighter code, like some of the new programming languages that are wrapping stuff and kind of hiding stuff from folks,
Yep.
and similarly, like, the example of Minecraft, I'll bring up,
Sure.
the kind of no code thing, but
Yep.
people can build, a universe and play in it and
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Hmm.
So it's a good lesson to learn,
It
simple.
is. And I never want to come across to saying that, coding is done for the world. That is not the case, and I don't think
It-
anyone believes that.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. The reality is we still need, people who understand how to code. But I think that one of the unique things that low code environments bring, especially to networking professionals, is it helps them in their transition to how to think like a developer. And that's the real key to it.
Yeah.
Right? Because when we start thinking, doesn't mean we have to be developers. When we start thinking that way, when we break down big problems into small digestible pieces, and we think about the flow, and we think about error cases, and we think about divergent paths, that's a good place for network people to be.
Right,
A
because
real good place.
traditionally configuration, for example, just configuration was, somebody like Brent rocking up to the terminal and make a change and commit, right?
Yep.
And that had problems, not
It's
specifically Brent,
absolutely.
but like
It did.
people making changes in config in the middle of the day or whatever, right? I mean, there's
Hmm.
stories from level 3 and all kinds of places I can tell you where like suddenly nothing worked, you
Yeah,
know?
Everybody's looking
absolutely.
for the out of band console list.
Right.
Indeed, indeed. And then the password that you have isn't the right one, and oh yeah.
It's from 2002.
Absolutely.
Where is it?
Yeah.
Where's my terminal server? Where's my, how can I break the network today? But you're right. It's like
Exactly.
it's not a dumbing down. It's a simplification is really, I guess, the way
Correct.
I look at it. It's not making it, less technical or whatnot or less robust. It's just making it easier to operate, which is
Yeah.
the goal.
And I think in a lot of respects, and I honestly believe this, is that one of the great things to come out of, a lot of these tools and turning to software to help with, the configuration and operations of networks, is it allows network engineers to get back to doing really what they love, and that is
Network
building and engineering networks,
networks,
right?
right?
There aren't many network engineers that are going to sit down and say, yeah, I love the fact that I pound out CLI commands for 6 hours a day.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
that's actually kind of the complaints I got early on, from the net ops kind of people who were CLI jockeys really at the
yeah.
time. And these folks, we've worked with folks like this all the time. You sit down, they could design anything in network space, especially certainly with the hardware they had. But then, like you talked about automating the processes, it was always, well, we can write some bash scripts and whatever, and then all the problems that we've talked about, so
Absolutely.
it's not it's more of it's making it more effective, I guess is the way I look at it.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
And it's helping it to scale, which is also a big key of this, right? Companies need to be able to
yeah,
scale their operational environments with automation in a way that, you think about this onslaught we're all watching, this tidal wave coming around 5G and the
yep,
push towards edge services. To think about some of the complexities of the infrastructures that are going to get built and need to be managed and operated as we go forward are going to be substantial. We're long past the days of network engineers keeping the whole thing in their head. They just
right.
can't do it anymore.
Well, they're not only substantial, can't be they can't work cost wise if they're run
Hmm.
that way. And an
That's right.
example of that are smaller. We like you mentioned 5G thing. One of the cool parts about the current 5G situation is the disaggregation of everything. The problem with
Yep.
the disaggregation though is that unless you're a company that can aggregate the things together, you're going to rely on integrators or whatever. And I'm thinking like enterprises, for example, that have a
Hmm.
small IT department as it is. Um, and adding to that load is never appreciated, and being able to show up
Absolutely.
and say, no, but if you automate it like this, you can get to that scale.
Hmm.
That's a conversation I've had with kind of even not just small enterprises, but even the non-gigantic ones. They really have a hard time adopting any of these new things because there's a lot of coding or stuff they have to
Hmm.
figure out, and making it into a like a form factor they can consume right away, because they're writing documentation basically.
Yeah,
That
without
really
question.
makes sense. Um,
Without question. And it's amazing. You talk to some of the enterprises that have gone down this journey already a little bit. And what's shocking, I think, to them, or what I get back from when I speak with a lot of customers, is they're surprised at suddenly they look back and what started as seemingly a very innocuous little project has now turned into they're managing,
yeah,
enough code to be their own software company.
right. What happened here? Right. And that's
Yeah,
what some of the
exactly.
other solutions that are out there, they basically, and I think a lot of us are guilty of this too, is the beginning of the kind of open source networking wave that happened, where we encouraged um, telcos and customer non-vendors effectively to write code and participate in code. But
Hmm.
that's a weird expectation for a lot of places like that because they don't have the resources. So then what do they do?
Yep.
Then
Yep.
it turns into or they start getting the resources and what you said. They went, whoa, wait a minute. Why didn't we buy this? you know,
Exactly.
we just wrote
Exactly.
Ansible again, but now we get to
Yeah,
maintain it ourselves,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Oh man, so many folks I've talked to, that's kind of the path they put themselves on.
Yeah, there's a
And
lot of that, and
it's tough.
that's a real thing.
Yep.
But
Yep. Without question. Without question.
so
So,
we're kind of getting up on the towards the top of the hour.
mhm.
I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you is where is stuff going in the space? Like, what are you seeing? Like what you're doing now with Itential?
Mhm.
You mentioned the pairing of testing with the pipelines and that kind of thing. Where's all that going? And is it going to help this 5G thing
Well, I hope so.
or make it worse?
I mean, that's the hope, right? I mean, if believe me, if I had a definitive answer, to that, I'd be a very rich man. But
Right. Yes.
I think there's a couple of things, in terms of where it's going today. I think that, I touched on a couple of them earlier, but just put the whole picture together. That the action of automation is no longer enough for the enterprise. It really needs to be. You need to be able to automate the end to end, and that starts from the moment the request was created to the moment the request was completed and everything in between. That includes everything from understanding the change to checking if the change is possible, to making the change, to validating the change, to testing the change, to closing everything out. And I think that it's bringing together a lot of purpose-built platforms in such a way that organizations are able to make some kind of cohesive understanding of how all the pieces work together.
Yep.
And I think the way that happens is, through this pipeline adoption concept. And we're seeing more and more organizations really start to identify how do we build some of these pipelines in order to do all of these.
Cool.
So,
Yeah, that's a really I'm seeing similar things happening.
mhm.
As even the telcos that are trying to do the integration of 5G themselves, they're finding what you said. You know, it's not just automation. They're finding somebody has to test this whole thing in the context that we're going to use the thing with all the other kids in the room. You know, the whole thing, right? And that's a hard, you know, a high hill to climb for even a telco that has a lot of resources. And when you show up in an enterprise and say, let's do a 5G thing, but you get to roll it yourself.
Yeah,
That
good
doesn't
luck.
go very far, right?
Good luck.
Good luck. And even in the ones that are provided, you know, are sold to enterprises, you know, like seeing a bunch of the cloud folks now selling private 5G services, all that, they still need to do this stuff.
No
They're
question.
running a disaggregated stack on their own. You know, they don't just buy this in a box either. And, you know, so even those folks need to do this sort of stuff too, right?
Yep, no question. No question.
Oh,
I
cool.
think the other thing that's exciting to continue to keep an eye on, and honestly, I don't know how it's going to, you know, come together yet. I don't know if anyone does, but it is exciting to start to see organizations realizing that there needs to be a correlation of some sort between the app stack and the infrastructure, right? They cannot continue to operate independent of one
They're
another.
not separate anymore.
That's right.
They're
That's
very
right.
related. And especially, you know, cases like I was mentioning where you're running a virtual router now on OpenStack or something,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And that's no longer tested in that combo by whoever you bought the VR from.
That's
You know,
right. Yep.
necessarily.
Exactly.
You know, and with all of your other stuff around it. So it's a good example. Yeah.
Yep. Without question. So it's an
Cool.
exciting time being in
Yeah.
this industry.
No, I mean, I was thinking about this morning before, you know, a couple hours ago. I was thinking about, you know, what am I going to talk to Peter about? And it was really like I was thinking like, wow, we're in a much better place than we were 15 years ago with this
Oh
stuff,
yeah.
right? I mean,
Without question.
I still remember like tearing my hair out, like way back when, writing CLI commands, going, this is not the way to,
There's
you know,
got to be a better
something,
way.
something distasteful about this, and I can't quite figure it out yet, you know. But
For sure.
So Peter, for the majority of enterprises that are still actually paying everything out through the CLI, what's
Yeah.
your first step? Like, so they get Peter Sprygada as a free consultant for the next couple of minutes here. Like,
sure.
if you go into a shop that is still kind of traditionally managing the
Yeah.
network one box at a time, like what are the first couple of steps you recommend?
Yeah, you know, it's a couple of things. One is don't fear the technology, right? Don't be fearful of it. That's first and foremost. Two, just do something. You know, I always talk with enterprises, even if all you ever automate in your life is automatically setting an SNMP community on your box, right? If that's all you ever do, fine, but start somewhere and start small. I think that so many organizations where they go wrong is they come up with this boil the ocean kind of plan. I'm going to automate my entire
Automate
infrastructure,
everything today,
right?
right?
And that's just not true. In fact, there's numbers of organizations for good reasons that there are parts of their network they will never automate. You know, depending on why it's there and what it does and so forth. So be accepting of that. And then three, and what I always tell people is, you know, there is a lot of opinions out there, no question about it, right? I've got them, we all have them, you know, buy versus build, you know, versus, you know, we could go on and on. Try not to let yourself get caught up in that, right? Just do, right? Just try, and you'll figure it out as you go forward. But that's really, you know, how I advise folks to get started. And then last but not least is commit to the process. Commit to the fact that you want to get off of the CLI. It isn't going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a month. But if you're diligent and you stick with it, it will get there and it will get better.
Cool.
That's what I would tell folks.
Well, on that note, we're kind of at the top of the hour here, so we're gonna have to wrap it up and call it a day. So thanks again, Peter, for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having
really
me.
Cool
This has been
conversation,
great.
man.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love it. I could do this all day long.
I know.
So, that's good stuff.
This is why we do it. This stuff is super fun to talk
is.
about and work on, for that matter.
Indeed.
So thanks again, and
My pleasure.
you know, as things progress, stay in touch. We'd love to have you on again in the future.
Fantastic. Yep, would be great.
Cool. Thanks again. And thanks again for everybody listening out there. This has been the latest episode of the net.lol. Thanks a lot.
And of course, thanks to our wonderful sponsor, T1 Nexus, who you should go to if you need optical stuff, because they're awesome.